Hello, and welcome to Backer Breaks It Down. So let's talk about the graphs of sine and cosine. So previously we talked about periodic functions. Okay, sine and cosine are two very specific examples of periodic functions. So I had you look at these two graphs at the top here, and I asked you to compare the two and determine which characteristics apply to sine, cosine, or both. And so when it comes to domain, both of these go forever to the left and to the right. So they both have a domain of negative infinity to positive infinity. Both of them have a range from -1 to +1. So they go as low as -1, they go as high as +1. Both of them have a period of 2 pi. So the period is like the length of one cycle. Okay. Both of them have an amplitude of 1. Okay. Both of them have a midline at y equals 0. Both of them are periodic. Okay. When it comes to the x-intercepts, the graphs on the next page in your notes kind of like show these a little bit better. Okay. So for sine, they have x-intercepts of like 0, pi, and 2 pi. And cosine has x-intercepts of pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. Okay. So when we say odd multiples of pi over 2, that'd be cosine, because odd is like 1, 3, 5, 7, so on. So 1 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. Sine has x-intercepts at multiples of pi, because it was like 0 pi, 1 pi, and 2 pi. Passes through 0, 0, that would be sine. Okay. Whereas cosine passes through 0, 1. And then when it comes to max and mins, looking at sine, it has a maximum of like pi over 2 and a minimum at 3 pi over 2. So those would be odd multiples of pi over 2. Whereas cosine, its maximum, you have like this is 0 pi, 2 pi, and the minimum's at 1 pi. So that'd be cosine. Okay. So sine and cosine, they have a period of 2 pi. And so I can, if I'm given a very simple function of the form like y equals a times sine of b of x, or y equals a times cosine of b of x, I can identify the amplitude. So remember, the amplitude is that like distance from the midline to like the maximum. And so that distance is going to be equal to the absolute value of the a term. And the period is 2 pi divided by b, because something that's really interesting, right, is like we just got done talking about how like sine and cosine have a period of 2 pi. For your basic sine function, you have y equals sine of x. Well, it's easy to see the amplitude, right? The amplitude is 1, but where is that period of 2 pi? Because like this one here has a b value of 1. So in the b value in our function, I'll write it down here. So when our b value is 1, our period is 2 pi. So if I'm identifying the period of the function given its formula, then I need to take whatever that b value is, and I need to go 2 pi divided by b. Okay, and that's like what this is saying here. Because when you just look at y equals sine of x, I don't see 2 pi anywhere like in that formula, right? Y equals sine of 2 pi of x has an a value of 1, it has a b value of 1. So I take the absolute value of a, that's my amplitude. To get the actual period of the graph, I have to go 2 pi divided by my b value, okay? So taking a look at 1 through 3, I'm just simply identifying the amplitude and period. So remember, the amplitude is going to be the absolute value of a, because it's a positive. Remember, it's the distance from the midline to the maximum, right? So number 1, since a is 3, the amplitude is 3. In problem 2, since a is -3, the amplitude is the absolute value of that. So that means it's just 3. And then in problem number 3, the amplitude is 2. To get the period of these functions, I need to go 2 pi divided by b. So in number 1, b is 2. So my period is going to be 2 pi divided by 2. So the period is simply pi. In problem 2, my b value is 2 pi. So I have to go 2 pi divided by b. So I'm going 2 pi divided by 2 pi. Therefore, the period is 1. And then in problem 3, I have to go 2 pi divided by 1/4. Okay, and you can do this on a calculator. I wouldn't type the pi in. I would put the 1/4 in parentheses. All right, but do the 2 divided by 1/4 on the calculator. So you'll get a, and then don't forget there is a pi here. Okay, so we have to go 2 pi divided by the b value to get the period of the function. Okay, if you're going from the graph to the b value, you would just do the same thing. You'd go 2 pi divided by the period is b. Okay. So speaking of graphs, how do you know whether or not it's sine or cosine? Well, if the selected starting point occurs at the midline of the graph, you're going to use the sine function. Okay. And when it comes to the selected starting point, I generally look at the y-axis. So I look at the y-intercept, and hopefully it's a good starting point, right? And if it's not, well, we get into that later. Okay. So look at the y-intercept, and if it's at the midline, it's a sine function. If it's at a maximum or minimum value, then it's the cosine function. And then also pay attention to whether the function has been flipped. Okay. So when I look at number 4, I usually look at my y-intercept for my starting point. And this one starts at the maximum, so this is best represented by cosine. The period, I can very easily see that cosine starts at 1, and this is what 1 full cycle of cosine looks like, so the period is 2 pi. My goodness. The midline, okay, so I can kind of see where that midline is located, and I can see it's located at -3, so I'm going to write y equals -3. And the amplitude is that vertical distance from the midline to the max, and so my amplitude is 2. Right, so I didn't really ask you to write a function here, but if I did, okay, cosine, it looks perfect. It hasn't been flipped, so I'd have like y equals, the amplitude is 2, it's cosine. And then when it comes to my b value, since the period is 2 pi, what that means is that b is going to be 2 pi divided by the period, okay, because 2 pi is normal, right? And so I just get 1. So I'm going to have 1x and then -3. So that's like what my function would look like. Okay, so let's take a look at number 5. Right, sine or cosine? Well, I like this point right here on the y-axis. So since it's at the midline, I'd say it's sine. And it has not been flipped because sine usually increases and then it decreases and then it comes back to its midline. So there I just highlighted 1 cycle of sine. So it has a period of 2 pi. The midline, I can see the midline to be 2, so y equals 2. And the amplitude is that height between the midline and the max. So from 2 to 5, so that's 3. So even though I didn't ask, my sine function would look like this. So I'd have y equals, the amplitude is 3, sine has not been flipped, so sine. Since the period is 2 pi once again, that's 1x, and then plus the midline, so plus 2. So that's like what my function would look like, okay? And so here, very basic, sine, cosine, their functions, what they look like. So here you have 1 full cycle of sine, 1 full cycle of cosine. This is in their standard position, so not flipped. The amplitude is equal to the absolute value of that a term. The period can be found by dividing 2 pi divided by b. If the starting point is on the midline, it's sine. If it's at the max, it's cosine, and just pay attention to whether or not it's been flipped. And that's how Backer breaks it down.